Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Lee, and for inviting me to participate in this event, George and Natasha. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of the emerging evidence in education and to hear from all of you today. I will assume, unless any of you stop me, that you can see my screen right now that has the presentation, but please holler in case something is not working. For those of you who are not familiar, I'll start today with a brief introduction to JPAL. JPAL is a global research center headquartered within MIT's economics department with 7 regional offices around the world. JPAL's mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence and that research is translated into action. At the heart of our approach is the use of randomized evaluations, also known as randomized control trials or RCTs. Randomized evaluations are one type of impact evaluation method used to measure the impact of social programs and policies. For the sake of time, I won't talk more about these now, but would be happy to describe them further if of interest during the Q&A. At JPAL, we work with a network of more than 200 of the world's foremost development economists who are united in their use of impact evaluations to generate evidence on effective approaches to reduce poverty. We at JPAL focus specifically on their randomized evaluations. Our network of affiliated researchers have now carried out more than 1,000 randomized evaluations in 88 countries around the world. That research falls into the 10 sectors you see listed here. Today, we'll of course focus on evidence from the education sector, one of our largest sectors at JPAL. Our network has nearly 270 education-related evaluations in almost 50 countries in many regions of the world, as you see on the map here. At JPAL, the education sector is led by 2 academic co-chairs who are experts in education research and who guide all of our work. JPAL's local grounding is critical to the success of our work. As briefly mentioned earlier, we have 7 regional offices and many more satellite offices around the world. Our teams in these offices understand local issues, local contexts, and local languages, and they form close relationships with partners like governments, advocacy organizations, and NGOs to help map evidence to the priorities of the partner and to build up a culture of evidence-informed policymaking in these places around the world. So how exactly does this work? At JPAL, as mentioned earlier, we conduct randomized evaluations to evaluate programs and policies that seek to reduce poverty. From there, we seek to disseminate this evidence through policy outreach with policymakers, donors, and practitioners in conversations like we're having with all of you today. We complement this outreach with targeted capacity building so that these key stakeholders can better understand and use the evidence, ultimately leading to more evidence-informed decisions moving forward. Now, moving on to the crux of today's presentation, I'll start by briefly describing the global learning crisis and educational context we're in, which most of you are quite familiar with already. Before the coronavirus pandemic hit in early 2020, the world was already experiencing a learning crisis. Although primary school enrollment had risen to more than 90% in low and middle income countries, students were struggling to learn. In Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, for example, 3/4 of grade 3 students could not read a basic sentence in 2014. And in rural India, half of grade 3 students could not solve a 2-digit subtraction problem in 2018. And the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating this learning crisis and widening learning gaps around the world. As many of you have experienced firsthand, COVID-related school closures have affected approximately 94% of the world's student population. And experts predicted that the share of children below minimum proficiency levels is expected to increase by 25% due to the pandemic. Additionally, learning inequality has increased, with the most disadvantaged children and youth facing the largest learning deficits, given differential access to remote learning and home conditions during school closures. A year and a half into the pandemic, many education systems have reopened, some fully in person, some fully remote, and others in a hybrid format, as you see on this map here. Students, teachers, and government officials are facing a radically transformed educational experience. The rest of this presentation highlights some of the evidence on how to address these varied models of reopening so student learning actually improves as students are back in the classroom. Now that we've outlined the learning crisis, what can we do to combat it? I'll spend the rest of the time today sharing research insights in a few thematic areas related to improving learning that we think are particularly relevant post-COVID. These topics include parental engagement, shifting business as usual instruction, and education technology. To start with the evidence on engaging parents or caregivers in their child's education, something that can be done while schools are still remote. To share a bit of motivation, parents and students often lack key information to make well-informed decisions related to education. For example, choosing which school your child will attend is a big decision, and parents might not understand how the choice of a specific school today might affect their child down the line. Additionally, students may not have examples in their lives to demonstrate the wage returns to education, especially when the cost of staying in school may feel much higher than dropping out to get a job. These gaps in knowledge vary in content, but they exist across contexts. As such, making sure that parents and students have access to the information they need to make the best decisions is a key part of supporting student learning. One way to address these knowledge gaps and potentially curb learning loss during the pandemic is by providing parents with actionable guidance on how to be involved in their child's education over the phone. I'll start with an example from Botswana during COVID school closures. In partnership with Young Love and the Botswana Ministry of Basic Education, researchers identified households willing to receive remote learning support via mobile phones. Students in households that received weekly SMS text messages with a series of numeracy problems of the week, paired with 20-minute phone calls with Young Love staff who walked parents and students through the problems, increased their math skills after 12 weeks. In another example from the United States, conducted prior to the pandemic, parents received 2 texts per week encouraging literacy activities during the summer when kids were out of school. You can see here on this slide an example of a text sent through the program to give parents a concrete idea for an activity that they could do right now to encourage literacy for their child. This program also had positive results. It increased learning outcomes for children in grades 3 and 4. In both of these examples here, parents became more engaged in their children's education, and they had a better understanding of their child's learning levels. Shifting gears now to working with students in the classroom, I'll share some evidence on changing business as usual instruction. When thinking about strategies to improve student learning, providing inputs is an obvious and an intuitive place to start. Perhaps learning isn't happening because of limited resources in schools and classrooms. However, many studies have looked at adding inputs in low and middle income classrooms, like textbooks, flip charts, adding teachers to reduce class size, etc. Consistently, these studies have showed no impact on learning. Test scores did not improve. Even when schools were provided with cash grants to spend on things they needed most, there were no lasting gains in learning. So the key takeaway is that while school-based resources and inputs are necessary to providing education, they're not sufficient to ensure learning. And if adding inputs are the only changes being made to an education system, learning likely will not shift. However, research does show some promising results when inputs are linked to pedagogy and school governance changes. For example, when hardware, technology, is combined with personalized software, pedagogy. One example of this is the MindSpark evaluation in Delhi, India. Developed by Educational Initiatives, MindSpark is a computer-assisted learning software that provides students with personalized instruction. The software delivers customized content targeted at the child's level, and it dynamically adjusts to the student's progress. This program was delivered after school, and it provided students with 45 minutes of the personalized software and 45 minutes of instructor-led small group instruction. This program increased learning levels across all groups of students, regardless of their initial achievement, gender, or wealth. After 4.5 months, students had 2 times greater improvement in math and 2.5 times greater improvement in Hindi. Building on this last example, which personalized instruction to each student's learning level, there is a broader body of evidence in education which supports this idea of targeted or tailored instruction programs. 15 randomized evaluations in Chile, Kenya, Peru, Ghana, the United States, and many from India all support the finding that tailored instruction is one of the most effective and cost-effective ways to improve learning outcomes. Different models of tailoring instruction have been found to be effective, both during and after school. And evidence suggests that the teaching itself can be done effectively by tutors, by volunteers, by teachers, or through education technology, as we just saw in the MindSpark example. Here, we've mapped a number of these programs together using a rough and admittedly arbitrary cutoff line meant to give a sense of practical significance of magnitudes. You can see that these programs consistently had positive impacts across contexts. One such example is Indian NGO Pratham's Teaching at the Right Level, or TARL, approach, which divides children, generally who are in grades 3 to 5, into groups based on their learning needs rather than their age or their grade, dedicating time to foundational skills rather than focusing solely on the curriculum, and regularly assessing student performance rather than relying only on end-of-year examinations. Over more than 15 years, JPAL and Pratham have partnered to rigorously test various versions of the TARL approach, as you see here on this chart, identifying 2 models ready for scale, which are now reaching students in India and 11 countries in Africa. Now, to just briefly touch on education technology more broadly, something that we can leverage while schools are remote or while they're in person. I'll summarize some high-level takeaways drawing upon a review paper written by JPAL in 2017. The main takeaway from the evidence is that EdTech is only as effective as the mechanism it is helping to deliver. It's not the education technology itself, but how the technology is used by parents, schools, children, and how it's incorporated into the classroom. To break this down further, first, education technology alone is not effective. This fits with our general lesson that access to educational inputs alone does not necessarily increase learning on its own. Second, computer-assisted learning that combines hardware with effective pedagogical software is more promising. This aligns with the MindSpark example, which also ties to our broader lesson on tailored instruction. Third, technology-based nudges ties into the lesson on parental engagement and how sometimes providing people with information they didn't have before can increase learning. And finally, here are a few key takeaways, mostly from studies in the United States about online learning, which we won't discuss in depth now for the sake of time. Here's a quick summary of what we discussed today. I won't go into detail about this now, but happy to discuss anything further in the Q&A. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to hear your questions and learn from all of your perspectives.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was really informative. And I mean, what you said was so true. It's not about just having technology, it's how it's implemented, how it's used. And I think that's a very important point. And the parental engagement is so important that if you lack information, if you get more parents involved and you have them, whether that's through text message, phone calls, or either through the internet, whatever means, you're going to see success. So that was great sharing your stories, your results there. That's incredible. We have 2 questions for you that have come through in the chat. The first question we have for you is, what do parents need to have in mind when choosing a school these days? What should they have in mind?
That is a really good question. Thank you very much for asking that. I am not a parent myself or an educator myself, so I may not be best placed to think about this, but you know, there are 2 sort of subsets of outcomes we think about when we are talking about educational outcomes. The first is thinking about outcomes on school participation. So whether or not you have students actually attending schools once they're enrolled. And then the second set of things we think about is learning. So more of the topics that I covered today. And so one sort of thinking about the first set of educational outcomes on school participation, I think sort of keeping in mind access as you're looking at schools. If you're thinking about the transportation costs of getting to school, if someone is not feeling well on a certain day, or if it's really hard or inconsistent to be able to actually get to school, then it might lower people's attendance and then therefore ability to learn while in the classroom. So I do think it's interesting and important to think about the ability to access these schools. And then, can you still hear me? My screen just shifted.
You.
Okay.
I have a second question as well for you. Oh, sorry, did you want to finish there? Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically just thinking about access, thinking about your child's goals themselves, communicating with schools to understand what the classrooms look like, what the educational goals look like, and to see if the teachers would be able to sort of provide more of a tailored instruction, I think is something that I would find particularly useful, to have an understanding of whether or not teachers are teaching sort of to the curriculum, to the test, or if they can really focus on your child's needs and where your child is a second thing I would consider.
Great, great. Thank you for sharing. The other question we have is, what happens in communities where parents have literacy issues themselves?
That's a really good question. And so a lot of our researchers actually think about this in close partnership with people who are on the ground, often NGOs who are implementing programs or education systems themselves. And so as we are thinking about designing interventions to reach parents and to provide additional information, literacy is super important. So first we need to consider, if we're trying to reach people via the phone, who has access to a phone. And in the case that someone may not have a phone, we may want to try other modes of getting out information, either through community-wide engagement, through pamphlets, through other ways to connect with community members. And then when we're designing interventions themselves, if we're designing them targeted at communities where parents do not have high literacy, then it doesn't make sense to send text messages that are written, because the parents would not be able to understand that. So in those cases, you could consider having a phone call, making sure someone speaks the local language that the parents speak as well, and you can have that conversation, or again, have other community outreach. But that's a really good question, and literacy is something very important to consider, and also something to think about is, if parents haven't had access to education themselves, they might not themselves understand all of the benefits of education. So really just trying to make this as salient as possible in an accessible manner can help assist sort of children in their learning experiences.
Well,